Hello guys, and welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we are taking you deep into one of the most forbidden nights in Vatican history, a night so scandalous that centuries later popes would try to bury every trace of it under silence and prayer. Picture this. It is the evening of October 31st, 1501, the eve of All Hallows. When the boundary between the living and the dead was believed to grow thin, you are crouched behind a marble column in the papal palace. The air is thick with incense, but also with something heavier, intoxicating, almost suffocating. Shadows tremble across frescoed walls where painted saints and pagan gods alike stare down at the spectacle below their holy eyes, forced to witness what no scripture ever foresaw. You hear the rustle of silk sliding across stone, the burst of laughter too loud for a place that calls itself sacred. Your heart races because you realize you are about to see what no faithful pilgrim ever should, the most infamous evening of corruption in the Catholic Church's history. An orgy so brazen, so elaborate that it would make even the Romans of antiquity, the emperors who filled their halls with gladiators and concubines, blush in shame. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from and what hour has the night brought you? Outside, the October air carries the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors, a humble reminder of ordinary Roman life. But inside these private chambers, chestnuts will soon become something far more than food. They will be props in a grotesque performance, symbols of a papacy that had abandoned humility and turned holiness into spectacle. This night would be remembered as the Banquet of Chestnuts. 50 courtesans assembled in the Vatican apartments of Rodrigo Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, prepared to entertain cardinals, nobles and ambassadors. The accounts of what happened there would not survive in rumour alone. They would be preserved with the cold detachment of a witness in the private diary of Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. His quill would scratch down the details with an unblinking honesty that made even later Vatican archivists tremble when they rediscovered it. For centuries, that diary lay sealed in the Vatican's secret archives like a confession too dangerous to release. But history, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise back into the light. Tonight we pull back the veil on those hidden hours, not to revel in their scandal, but to understand how the Church of Rome, the most powerful institution in Christendom, reached a point where its own head, the so-called Vicar of Christ, presided over spectacles that blurred the line between sacred ritual and pagan debauchery. Because this is not just the story of one night. It is the story of a dynasty, the Borgias, and of Rodrigo Borgia, the man who became Pope Alexander VI, a pope who reigned not only with a cross in his hand, but also with the ruthless ambition of a Renaissance warlord and the appetites of a prince who believed himself untouchable. As the flames of candelabras sputtered and the courtesans prepared to crawl naked across the marble floor gathering chestnuts like animals in heat, Rome itself stood at a crossroads. To some, the scandal was a whispered curiosity. To others, it was living proof that the papacy had been consumed by greed and corruption. Reformers would seize upon it. Protestants would later brandish it as evidence that the church had rotted from within. And yet for the guests in that room, there was no sense of history unfolding. There was only the intoxication of power, flesh, and wine. Only the thrill of testing how far the sacred walls of St. Peter's house could be desecrated before God himself would intervene. This, friends, is where our journey begins. From a small Spanish town where Rodrigo Borgia was born to the marble corridors of the Vatican, where his son orchestrated the banquet that would echo through centuries. A story of ambition and ruin of faith corrupted and power unchecked. The story of how chestnuts scattered across Vatican floors became eternal symbols of human weakness in the face of temptation. And as we step into that story together, I must warn you, what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. It is history stripped of its sanctity, history whispered through clenched teeth by those who tried to keep it hidden. But here in the shadows of the Renaissance, truth burns brighter than any candle. Welcome to the Banquet of Chestnuts, the rise of Rodrigo Borgia. The story of Pope Alexander VI. The man at the centre of the Vatican's darkest scandal begins far from the marble corridors of Rome. Rodrigo Borgia was born Rodrigo de Borgia on January 1, 1431 in the sun-baked town of Sativa near Valencia in Spain. The hills around his birthplace were draped with olive groves and the air carried the dust of roads that had been walked by peasants, merchants and Moorish traders for centuries. It was a world of bright light and hard soil, far removed from the gilded shadows he would one day command. Yet even in those early years, destiny was pulling Rodrigo away from the provincial life of his neighbours. His family was of minor nobility, respectable but not extraordinary. What made them extraordinary was a single figure who rose higher than any Spaniard of their generation, Rodrigo's uncle Alonso de Borgia. Alonso had climbed the ecclesiastical ladder with remarkable speed, a man more politician than priest, whose skills in law and diplomacy eventually carried him all the way to the papal throne as Pope Calixtus III in 1455. That election changed Rodrigo's life. In an age when nepotism flowed through the church like wine at a feast, family connection was more powerful than piety. Calixtus showered his relatives with positions, and young Rodrigo was among the greatest beneficiaries. At just 25 years old, still more youth than statesman, Rodrigo was elevated to the rank of cardinal deacon. His meteoric rise was not the result of divine calling or saintly virtue. It was bloodline, pure and simple family ties sealed with wax and stamped with papal bulls. The sudden change must have been dizzying. Imagine one day a Spanish cleric with dusty shoes, the next a prince of the church with access to wealth, lands and influence across Europe. Rodrigo embraced his new station with a hunger that would define his entire life. His was not the hunger of a mystic yearning for God. It was the appetite of a man who saw the Vatican not as a temple, but as the greatest marketplace in the world, and Rome rewarded such appetites. By the mid-15th century, the Eternal City was a paradox made flesh. Pilgrims from across Christendom flocked to her basilicas, climbing stone steps on their knees, lips mumbling prayers to saints whose relics glittered behind glass. The scent of incense drifted above gilded altars, while sunlight streamed through stained glass like divine fire. This was the Rome of salvation and eternal promises. But when night fell, a different Rome awoke. The same streets that carried pilgrims by day carried merchants of flesh by night. Taverns swelled with laughter, dice clattered in dark corners, and courtesans with painted eyes whispered promises to cardinals in crimson robes. Salvation could be bought, indulgences traded like coins at a marketplace, and the most holy offices were negotiated as though they were seats at a banquet. Rodrigo understood this duality better than most. He did not fight it, he thrived in it. The young cardinal began to spin his web of benefices, gathering church offices and lands across Europe with the precision of a spider weaving its strands. Money flowed into his coffers, influence accumulated in his hands, and with wealth came a lifestyle that resembled that of a Renaissance prince far more than a man of God. Banquets glittered with silver plates and rare wines. Palaces echoed with music and laughter. Rodrigo kept mistresses openly, a scandalous but hardly unusual practice among clerics of his age. From these liaisons came children, living testaments to both his lust and his ambition. He never denied them. In fact, he raised them as extensions of himself, pieces on the chessboard of politics. Even before he became Pope, Rodrigo's behaviour shocked Rome. Pope Pius II himself once wrote him a scathing letter, after hearing of his debauchery in Siena, condemning his conduct as scandalous to the entire court. But shame was something Rodrigo seemed incapable of. He was driven relentless, consumed by a vision that placed himself at the very summit of power, the papal throne. And so in the decades that followed, Rodrigo Borgia honed his craft. He learned the intricate dances of Roman politics, the quiet exchanges of favours, the art of smiling while hiding a dagger behind one's back. He cultivated allies and mistresses alike, each relationship another rung on the ladder he was climbing. Rome itself seemed to mould around him a holy city where salvation was preached by day and sold by night, and where Rodrigo, more than any other man, learned how to profit from both. It was this dual Rome, devout and corrupt, sacred and profane, that raised Rodrigo Borgia. And it was within this contradiction that his ambition burned brightest. For Rodrigo was no ordinary cardinal. He was a man preparing step by deliberate step to transform the Church of God into the empire of the Borgias. The Borgia dynasty is born. Rodrigo Borgia had already embraced the life of a Renaissance prince while still wearing the crimson robes of a cardinal. But the true foundation of his dynasty was not his titles, his palaces, or even his wealth. It was his children. And for those children, Rodrigo turned not to fleeting affairs with courtesans, but to a long and steady partnership with a Roman noblewoman who understood how to navigate the dangerous tides of papal politics, Vanozza de Catanei. Vanozza was no common mistress. Born into a respectable family, she was clever, practical and ambitious in her own way. She provided Rodrigo with stability in a city where alliances shifted like the Tiber's current. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore him 4 children who would become infamous in European history: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Each one of them would be shaped not by childhood innocence, but by the weight of their father's schemes. To Rodrigo, his children were never merely offspring. They were chess pieces, knights, bishops, pawns and queens to be moved across the board of Italy's volatile politics. And like any calculating player, he was willing to sacrifice them when the game demanded it. Juan the eldest was raised to be heir to power and privilege. Rodrigo showered him with titles, including Duke of Gandia, securing his status among Spain's most powerful families. He was meant to embody the family's dignity, though his reckless behaviour would later turn him into its greatest liability. Cesare's second-born was destined for the church. Barely 18, he was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, one of the richest sees in Christendom, and soon elevated to cardinal. But Cesare was not made for prayers or sermons. His ambition burned hotter than his father's, and the red robes chafed against his warrior's spirit. History would remember him not as a priest, but as a soldier and statesman of terrifying brilliance. Lucrezia, golden-haired and intelligent, became a living bargaining chip in Rodrigo's endless quest for alliances. She was forced into marriages that suited her father's political needs rather than her own heart. The rumours that later clung to her name of poison, incest and betrayal were in part the inevitable byproducts of being trapped within her father's schemes. And finally, Joffre the youngest was married off in adolescence to secure yet another alliance, a pawn traded on the chessboard of kingdoms. Even as he raised his children for these roles, Rodrigo's personal life remained a scandal in Rome. It was one thing for a cardinal to indulge privately. It was another to parade mistresses and illegitimate children openly, almost defiantly. His appetite for women was no secret. Indeed, his behaviour provoked one of the sharpest rebukes ever recorded from a reigning pope to a subordinate. In 1460, Pope Pius II wrote Rodrigo a blistering letter after reports of his conduct in Siena scandalized the entire city. Rodrigo, then in his late 20s, had reportedly hosted extravagant feasts filled with music, women, and indecency that shocked even a Renaissance court already accustomed to excess. We have learned, Pius wrote, that you conduct yourself in such a way that all who see you are scandalized. It was an extraordinary censure, but one that Rodrigo ignored. His ambition was simply greater than any shame. And in truth, why should he have feared the church of the late 15th century was an institution in which corruption was not the exception but the bloodstream itself. Nepotism was accepted simony. The buying and selling of offices was common knowledge, and concubinage among priests was an open secret. Cardinals lived like secular princes, building palaces, throwing feasts, fathering children. Rodrigo was more blatant than most, but he was not unique. What made him different was not the corruption itself, but his mastery of it. Where others stumbled or hid, Rodrigo flaunted. He turned vices into instruments of power. His mistresses became sources of alliances. His children became dynastic weapons. His reputation for scandal, rather than destroying him, seemed to harden his image as a man too formidable to be undone by gossip. Rome whispered. Other cardinals sneered behind fans of silk. Pius II himself condemned him. And still Rodrigo climbed, because in the papal court of the 15th century morality was optional. Power was everything, and Rodrigo Borgia scandal and all was preparing to seize it with both hands. The summer of 1492 in Rome was sweltering, the kind of heat that clung to marble and made tempers short. But inside the Sistine Chapel another fire was burning, a fire not of the Holy Spirit but of ambition, greed and whispered promises. The papal throne was vacant and 23 cardinals had gathered to elect a new vicar of Christ. It should have been a solemn affair with prayers rising like incense and divine providence guiding the decision. Instead, the conclave unfolded like a marketplace. Simony, the buying and selling of holy offices, was not a shameful secret but the unspoken law of survival. Gold changed hands as easily as blessings. Benefices were promised like bread at communion. Votes were bartered in hushed tones sealed with knowing nods, and sometimes with outright contracts. In this shadowy dance, one figure moved with more confidence than all the rest, Rodrigo Borgia. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. For decades he had cultivated allies, secured wealth, and proven his willingness to give as much as it took to secure loyalty. Now he poured money into the conclave like water into a fountain, flooding the chamber with promises. Entire territories, lucrative offices, estates, rich with tithes, everything was for sale if it meant the papal tiara would be his. The cardinals knew exactly what they were doing. Some accepted his bribes with feigned reluctance, others with eager hands. By the time the final votes were cast on August 11, 1492, there was little surprise in the outcome. Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. It was a victory achieved not through prayer or divine revelation, but through cold, calculated corruption. Even his contemporaries openly admitted this was simony in its purest form, and yet Rome celebrated. Perhaps it was because the city had grown accustomed to Rodrigo, the Spanish cardinal whose feasts, palaces, and intrigues were already legendary. Perhaps it was because in an age when corruption was everywhere, it seemed refreshing that at least this pope would not pretend otherwise. Whatever the reason, the eternal city erupted in joy. That night bonfires blazed across the 7 hills. Torchlit processions wound through the ancient streets, casting long shadows against crumbling ruins that had once seen emperors crowned. Triumphal arches were erected in his honour, as though Caesar himself had returned. Chroniclers recorded the event as the greatest ovation ever received by a pontiff. For a fleeting moment, Alexander VI seemed to embody magnificence, energy, and the hope of renewal. And in fairness, his first acts as pope did suggest a man capable of reform. Rome at the time was drowning in chaos. In the months before his election, over 200 assassinations had occurred in the city murders in alleys. His vendettas settled with daggers. Bandits prowled the countryside while thieves robbed pilgrims on their way to St. Peter's. Within weeks of taking power, Alexander restored order. He reorganized Rome's districts, assigning magistrates the authority to police the streets. He summoned citizens to bring grievances before him personally every Tuesday, hearing disputes with the air of a judge determined to be both firm and fair. Even critics marveled at his efficiency. For a brief moment, the papacy looked as though it might be reborn. But power, like wine, does not change a man, it reveals him. The same Rodrigo who had bought the papacy with gold could not abandon the appetites that had defined his rise. Behind the solemn vestments and the public gestures of justice, his heart beat with the same desire as wealth, legacy, and the advancement of his children. The people of Rome lit torches in celebration, believing that perhaps finally God had given them a shepherd strong enough to lead. But beneath the surface, in the very marrow of the papacy, the truth remained. Alexander VI had not been chosen by the Holy Spirit. He had purchased his crown, and though the city did not yet realize it, that purchase would cost the church its soul. Part 5. Power and Bloodlines. From the very moment Rodrigo Borgia secured the papal throne as Alexander VI, it became clear that his pontificate would not be about shepherding the universal flock, but about constructing a dynasty. To Alexander, the papacy was not simply a spiritual office, it was a fortress of power, and his children were the stones with which he would build it. He lavished his eldest son Juan with titles as though they were heirlooms passed from heaven itself. Juan became Duke of Gandia in Spain, a position that tied him firmly into the nobility of their homeland. To solidify his influence, Alexander arranged a marriage between Juan and Maria Enriquez de Luna, a cousin of King Ferdinand of Aragon. This was not only a union of bloodlines, but also a declaration the Borgias would weave themselves into the very fabric of Spanish royalty. Juan Golden and Proud was to be the standard-bearer of Borgia legitimacy. Cesare, however, was the son in whom Alexander's true ambitions found a sharper, more dangerous expression. At only 18, Cesare was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, a diocese wealthy enough to sustain princely ambitions. Soon after, Alexander elevated him to cardinal. The irony was not lost on Rome. Cesare, still little more than a youth, was already one of the most powerful clerics in Christendom. But to those who knew him, the red robe seemed like a costume ill-suited to his nature. Cesare was no man of prayer. His brilliance was in warfare strategy and the ruthless pursuit of domination. He played at piety because his father demanded it, but beneath the vestments was a wolf pacing restlessly in a sheep's pen. Alexander himself did little to conceal his own appetites either. His most notorious mistress, Julia Farnese, entered the papal court in her teens, a vision of golden hair and striking beauty. She was married off at just 15 to Orsino Orsini, but Alexander claimed her almost immediately. The Romans gave her a cruel nickname, Julia la Bella, a phrase both admiring and mocking for. It reminded everyone that her beauty was wielded not for her husband, but for the Pope. Julia's presence in the Vatican was so open that it scandalized even those accustomed to the corrupt habits of churchmen. She was seen walking freely through papal apartments, treated with deference by cardinals and servants alike. She was even called the Pope's bride, and some whispered of her, as a living insult to the Virgin Mary, a sacrilege against the very ideal of purity. Yet Alexander delighted in her parading her beauty, as though it legitimized his virility and his dynasty. For him, spiritual vows were less important than earthly displays of power and pleasure, and it was in the papal apartments that this theatre of excess reached its peak. The walls were adorned with frescoes of saints and martyrs, but their sanctity was drowned beneath the feast's music and revels that took place nightly. Cardinals and nobles gathered there for banquets that stretched into the earlier hours, drinking the Pope's wine, indulging in spectacles that blurred the line between sacred celebration and profane carnival. The Vatican, meant to be the seat of Christ's vicar, had become a Renaissance court as decadent as any palace in Florence or Naples. Every gesture, every appointment, every indulgence revealed the same obsession. Alexander was determined to elevate the Borgias from Spanish outsiders to an Italian dynasty that would outlast his papacy. He used his office to forge titles for Juan, church power for Cesare, and political marriages for his daughter Lucrezia. His children were not hidden sins, they were his strategy. Where other popes cloaked their illegitimacies in silence, Alexander turned them into weapons. The Vatican had always been a place where ambition mingled with devotion, but under Alexander VI, ambition no longer bowed its head before the altar. It strutted openly dressed in silk and gold as if the sacred had been rewritten to serve the Borgia name. The chronicler Johann Burchard, if the Borgias supplied the drama, it was Johann Burchard who became its most meticulous historian. Without him, much of what we know about Alexander VI's papacy would have dissolved into rumour whispers and hostile propaganda. Instead, Burchard left us something colder, sharper, and far more enduring. A diary written with the precision of a court stenographer, recording both majesty and scandal with the same dispassionate hand. Burchard was born around 1450 in Strasbourg, in the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike the flamboyant men he would one day serve, Burchard had little glamour about him. He studied canon law, rose through clerical ranks, and entered papal service not by force of charisma, but through quiet, consistent competence. His great appointment came when he was made Master of Ceremonies, the man responsible for orchestrating every ritual and liturgical event in the papal court. From coronations to funerals, from elaborate masses to the smallest public blessing, it was Burchard who ensured the choreography of the church moved without error. It was a position of paradoxical power. He was never high enough in rank to shape papal policy, nor low enough to be ignored. Instead, he existed in the liminal space between always present, rarely noticed, and almost never questioned. That invisibility became his greatest strength. Cardinals bickered, ambassadors plotted, courtesans flirted, and popes schemed all, while Burchard stood quietly at the edge of the room holding his notes. They forgot he was there. He never forgot what he saw, and what he saw he wrote down. Beginning in 1483 under Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard kept his Liber Notarum, the Book of Notes. Its pages are not embellished with moral judgments or flourishes of style. Burchard did not thunder against corruption like Savonarola, nor revel in scandal like a gossiping diplomat. Instead, he wrote with an accountant's tone, factual, dry, precise. He could describe the grandeur of a papal procession with the same spare detail as he used to recount a shocking indiscretion in the papal apartments. That flatness is exactly why his words carry so much weight. When later centuries accused him of exaggeration, defenders pointed out the very thing that made his writing so unnerving. Burchard never seemed to exaggerate at all. He recorded he did not sermonize. The detail of a liturgical vestment, the exact number of candles at an altar, or the placement of chestnuts on a Vatican floor each, was catalogued with equal seriousness. As Master of Ceremonies, Burchard had access few others enjoyed. He entered the Sistine Chapel during conclaves, stood behind papal thrones, and walked the private corridors of the Vatican, where few eyes were permitted. He was everywhere, and yet he was no one invisible, but everywhere, as one later historian put it. In that silence, in that watchfulness, Burchard became one of the most dangerous witnesses of his age. He never wielded a sword, never commanded soldiers, and never plotted like the Borgias themselves. But his pen was sharper than any blade, because it preserved the reality of Alexander VI's court long after the torches burned out and the courtesans were forgotten. It is thanks to Johann Burchard that the Banquet of Chestnuts was remembered not as idle rumour, but as an event detailed in the Vatican's own records. Without him we might dismiss the night as Protestant slander, or as an invention of scandal-hungry chroniclers. But his diary lies in the archives, clinical and unflinching, its words impossible to explain away. History often favours the loud kings, generals, and popes whose names echo across centuries. Yet sometimes it is the quiet figures, the ones who watch in silence and record without passion, who shape what posterity remembers. The Borgias gave Rome a theatre of power and vice. Burchard handed us the script, The Fall of Juan Borgia. For years, Alexander VI had lavished his eldest son Juan with titles, wealth and honours, convinced that Juan would be the shining pillar of the Borgia dynasty. He was Duke of Gandia, married into Spanish royalty, and paraded through Rome as the Pope's chosen heir in worldly matters. But beneath the gilded titles, Juan was reckless, arrogant and cruel, a young man who mistook his father's power for his own invincibility. Contemporaries whispered of his excesses. He drank too heavily, gambled without restraint, and seduced women without concern for scandal. Even his military ventures intended to prove him a worthy commander turned to embarrassment. Soldiers despised his incompetence, nobles mocked his arrogance, and enemies of the Borgias learned quickly that Juan was dangerous only to those too weak to resist. In Rome, stories spread of his brutality toward those beneath him, of his indulgence in pleasures that exceeded even the city's already lax standards. To many, Juan was not a prince in waiting but a liability. And then in June of 1497 the liability was erased. On the night of June 14th, Juan vanished after a banquet at his mother's villa. 3 days later his body was found floating in the Tiber. His throat had been cut and his torso bore 9 stab wounds. Whoever killed him wanted no ambiguity. It was a message carved into flesh that the Pope's golden boy was neither untouchable nor beloved. The shock was immediate and seismic. Rome buzzed with theories. Some whispered that rival families, perhaps the Orsini or the Colonna, had struck back at the Borgias. Others pointed to Juan's long list of personal enemies, men humiliated by his arrogance. More chilling still were the whispers that Cesare, his own brother, may have orchestrated the murder. Cesare's ambition had long chafed beneath Juan's favoured position, and with Juan gone, the path to leadership cleared as though by fate or by a dagger in the dark. For Alexander VI, the discovery of his son's mutilated body was devastating. The mighty Pope, so often seen as ruthless and immovable, retreated into grief that astonished even his critics. For 3 days and nights he locked himself away, refusing food and sleep. Witnesses said he wept like a broken man, a father rather than a pontiff, mourning the boy he had tried to mould into a prince. In his anguish, Alexander seemed to awaken to the corruption of his court. He announced sweeping reforms as if Juan's death had ripped away the veil of excess. He ordered measures to curb the luxury of cardinals, to suppress simur, to reorganize the apostolic chancery. He called for restraint in the papal household, for a renewed spirit of moral discipline. Chroniclers at the time wondered if divine justice had struck through Juan's murder, forcing the Pope to repent. For a brief flickering moment it seemed as though tragedy might succeed where criticism and scandal had failed. But grief in Alexander's heart was a storm that passed quickly. Within months the reforming zeal evaporated. The proposed ordinances were shelved, forgotten, as easily as a discarded love letter. Alexander returned to the familiar rhythms of indulgence and ambition, and his attention shifted to the son who remained by his side, Cesare. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was his sword, sharp, cold, and utterly without conscience. Where Juan had failed through arrogance and incompetence, Cesare excelled through calculation and brilliance. Juan's death, whether by accident, conspiracy, or fratricide, cleared the way for Cesare to step forward as the true heir of Borgia ambition. The murder of Juan Borgia sent shockwaves through Rome, but it also marked a turning point. The mask of family honour that Alexander had tried to drape over his dynasty was gone. What remained was naked ambition carried now by a son who had no patience for weakness. The Borgia game of power would continue, but from this point on it would be Cesare's game, Cesare's transformation. The murder of Juan Borgia had left a void at the very heart of the family's ambitions, but where one son had fallen, another was waiting sharper and more dangerous. Cesare Borgia had worn the red robes of a cardinal since his adolescence, yet those robes never sat easily on his shoulders. He was no man of prayer. His spirit was restless, drawn not to the silence of chapels, but to the clash of steel and the art of power. In 1498 he did the unthinkable. Cesare resigned his cardinalship, becoming the first man in history to voluntarily step away from the College of Cardinals. It was a gesture that stunned Christendom. For centuries, cardinals had clung to their positions as the surest path to influence. Cesare treated it as a discarded costume. His ambition demanded a wider stage. He wanted to be not a prince of the church, but a prince of Italy. The opportunity came swiftly. King Louis XII of France, newly ascended to the throne, sought papal approval to annul his marriage so that he could wed Anne of Brittany and unite her duchy with France. It was a delicate request, and annulment was no small matter even for a king. Alexander VI held the keys to Louis's desire, and he saw in it the perfect bargain. He would grant the annulment, and in return Cesare would be welcomed into the French orbit. Thus Cesare cast off his cardinal's robes and was given the title Duke of Valentinois in France, a name that earned him the Italian epithet by which he would be forever known Il Valentino. He married into French nobility, secured a pension from the king, and positioned himself as both papal prince and French ally. Where Juan had been bound to Spain, Cesare bound himself to France, an alliance that would shape Italy's fate. With French troops at his back and papal coffers filling his war chest, Cesare launched his campaigns across central Italy. The Romagna, a patchwork of petty lordships and turbulent cities, became his target. One by one he subdued them not only through open battle, but through a mixture of siege, warfare, treachery, and calculated brutality. At Imola and Forli, he struck with ruthless efficiency, breaking defences and executing those who defied him. At Cesena and Pesaro, he combined diplomacy with veiled threats, forcing submission before blood was spilled. Yet when resistance lingered, Cesare's hand was merciless. Assassination was as much a weapon to him as the sword. Enemies were invited to feasts and never returned home. Mercenary captains who betrayed him were captured, strangled, or left to rot as a warning. It was this blend of brilliance and terror that drew the fascinated gaze of one Florentine diplomat, Niccolo Machiavelli. Sent to observe Cesare on behalf of the Republic of Florence, Machiavelli saw in him a living embodiment of the qualities he believed necessary for a ruler. Cesare combined audacity with calculation, cruelty with purpose, fortune with sheer will. Machiavelli later wrote that if not for a single twist of fate, illness at the wrong moment, Cesare might have succeeded in building a lasting state. In his treatise, the Prince Machiavelli held Cesare up as the model of effective power, the man who understood that fear, when wielded correctly, was stronger than love. Cesare's transformation from reluctant cleric to warrior duke reshaped not only the fortunes of the Borgias, but the very landscape of Italy. With each conquest, he tightened the family's grip on the peninsula. With each act of ruthlessness, he carved his reputation deeper into the minds of allies and enemies alike. Where Juan had failed through weakness, Cesare triumphed through cold precision, and yet his rise came at a cost. His campaigns were expensive, his methods dangerous, and his hunger insatiable. Alexander VI had found in Cesare the instrument of his dynastic dreams, but also the embodiment of his own moral undoing. For if a pope's son could carve out a secular kingdom with blood and treachery, what did that say about the church that enabled him? The answer whispered in courts across Europe was damning. Financing the dream conquest intrigue and the grand ambitions of Cesare Borgia could not be fueled by bull or by steel alone. Armies had to be paid, castles supplied, mercenaries bribed, and loyalties secured. For this, Alexander VI turned to the most inexhaustible treasury at his disposal, the spiritual capital of the Catholic Church itself. What had once been an institution of faith became under his hand a mint for the Borgias' ambitions. The sale of indulgences, those slips of parchment promising remission of sins, became one of Alexander's most reliable fundraising tools. Once meant as spiritual encouragements for penance, indulgences were now hawked like wares in a market traded not for contrition, but for coin. Pilgrims who came to Rome seeking salvation were greeted not with sermons of repentance, but with clerks eager to negotiate their contributions. In the eyes of critics, it was as though forgiveness itself had been stamped with a price tag, and every coin dropped into papal coffers was another brick in Cesare's war machine. But indulgences were only the beginning. Alexander turned the very offices of the church into commodities. Benefices, those lucrative church appointments that came with revenues from lands and parishes, were sold openly to the highest bidder. Families desperate for prestige purchased bishoprics for sons barely old enough to shave, while noble houses competed for abbeys and monasteries, not out of piety but for the income they generated. Even the red hat of a cardinal, one of the most sacred symbols in Christendom, became a transaction. Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals during his reign, many chosen less for their spiritual merit than for their ability to pay. The College of Cardinals, swollen with men who had bought their seats, became less a senate of holy advisors and more a consortium of investors, each with a stake in the Borgia enterprise. Every hat meant thousands of ducats flowing into the papal treasury and ultimately into Caesar's campaigns in the Romagna. Rome itself began to feel less like the universal capital of Christendom and more like the personal kingdom of the Borgia family. Streets, palaces, and feasts all bore the stamp of their dominance. Courtiers knew that to curry favour in this Vatican it was to court the Borgias directly, and that opposition was a dangerous gamble. The Papal States, once a patchwork of territories meant to secure the Church's independence, were administered as if they were a dynastic inheritance. Alexander was the patriarch, Caesar the crown prince, and Rome the glittering heart of their dominion. Amid this web of power and corruption stood Lucrezia Borgia, Alexander's daughter. Blonde-haired, graceful and politically valuable, she was treated less as a child and more as a pawn to be moved whenever the board demanded. At 17 she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a powerful Milanese nobleman, to cement an alliance. But when that alliance no longer suited the family, Alexander forced an annulment on humiliating grounds impotence. The marriage was dissolved not for lack of love or fidelity, but because politics had shifted. Soon after, Lucrezia was remarried to Alfonso of Aragon, a younger relative of the King of Naples, to strengthen ties with the south. Yet when Cesare's plans required breaking with Naples, Alfonso's usefulness evaporated. In 1500 he was found stabbed on the steps of St. Peter's. Though he lingered for weeks, his killers returned to finish the job, strangling him in his hospital bed. Rome whispered that Cesare himself had ordered the murder, clearing the path for Lucrezia's next marriage alliance. For Lucrezia, each wedding veil was less a symbol of union than of imprisonment, each husband a placeholder in the Borgias' shifting strategies. Chroniclers painted her as a femme fatale, a poisoner, even an incestuous temptress. Yet modern historians suggest a more tragic truth. She was a daughter manoeuvred endlessly by her father and brother, denied the chance to live for herself. Alexander's fundraising, Caesar's campaigns, and Lucrezia's marriages were all threads in the same tapestry, a vision of the Borgia family, not merely as participants in the politics of Italy, but as masters of it. They ruled Rome as though it belonged to them by divine right, bending sacred offices into instruments of ambition. To critics, the papacy had become indistinguishable from any other Renaissance court, a place where salvation was bartered, alliances were bought with blood, and God's vicar behaved more like a dynastic monarch than a shepherd of souls. The dream was working for now, but dreams financed with corruption and cemented with blood have a way of collapsing. The Borgias' house of cards was rising higher than ever, and with each indulgence sold, each cardinal's hat auctioned, and each alliance sealed with Lucrezia's hand, the tension between sacred calling and profane ambition grew unbearable. Theatre of excess. If the papal apartments under Alexander VI were a palace, they were also a stage, a theatre where the lines between sacred ritual and profane carnival dissolved beneath torchlight and wine. To step into those chambers at night was to enter a world far removed from the prayers whispered in St. Peter's by day. There the Pope himself presided over entertainments that would have shocked even the decadent courts of Florence or Naples. The feasts spun innocently enough, with long tables laid with silver and gold groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits and wines drawn from the finest vineyards of Italy and Spain. Music drifted through the corridors, played by lutes and viols, while singers performed madrigals composed for the occasion. Masks followed elaborate performances where actors donned costumes of gods, satyrs and nymphs, classical figures mingling uneasily with the frescoed saints who looked down from the walls. But as the night deepened and inhibitions dissolved, the performances grew less symbolic and more explicit. Courtesans dressed in silks that shimmered by candlelight were invited into the company of cardinals and nobles. They laughed, danced and whispered with the very men sworn to chastity and spiritual discipline. Soon the dancers' veils slipped away, replaced by displays that made the guests roar with applause or sink into the shadows of desire. It was more than indulgence, it was spectacle. Every banquet was both entertainment and experiment. Alexander used these gatherings to test the loyalty of his cardinals and allies. Participation bound them to him, for by partaking in the excess they became complicit. A cardinal who drank and laughed beside courtesans in the Pope's presence would find it difficult later to denounce him without condemning himself. These feasts, with their heady mix of pleasure and politics, created a web of silent blackmail more effective than any oath. Ambassadors, too, were often present. To them, the feast was opportunities to negotiate treaties in whispers between dances, or to measure the Pope's favour by how freely the courtesans were offered. To be invited was both a privilege and a trap, a reminder that diplomacy in Rome could be conducted as easily over a banquet table as in a council chamber. And yet the consequences of such spectacles extended far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Rome, ever a city of gossip, buzzed with rumours of holy orgies. Servants whispered of cardinals stumbling from the papal chambers at dawn, their robes stained with wine. Musicians carried tales to taverns of the songs they had been ordered to play. Courtesans paid to remain silent sometimes could not resist the lure of boasting. To the common people of Rome, these whispers mingled with awe and disgust. Pilgrims who came to kiss the feet of Saint and Peter's statue might by evening hear tales of the Pope himself presiding over feasts that mocked Christian morality. The dissonance was staggering. In one city, Christ crucified was venerated by day, while Bacchus and Venus were celebrated by night. For Alexander VI, however, such contradictions were not problems but tools. His Vatican was a court where wealth and spectacle proclaimed power, where sacred office bowed before secular appetite, and where cardinals were drawn deeper into complicity with every goblet raised. The Church had become a stage and the Pope its impresario. And yet, as rumours spread, so too did outrage. Reformers began to seize upon these stories as evidence that Rome itself had become Babylon, reborn, a city not of saints but of sinners. The banquets, the masks, the courtesans mingling with cardinals, they were more than indulgences. They were harbingers of a crisis that would shake Christendom to its core. The stage is set 1500 to 1501. The year 1500 was no ordinary year. It was the Jubilee, a sacred moment in Catholic tradition when Rome became the centre of the Christian world. Every 100 years, pilgrims flooded into the eternal city to seek forgiveness of sins, indulgences, and a fresh start for their souls. They came by the tens of thousands, trudging across mountains and plains, arriving barefoot, weary, and clutching rosaries. They came from France, Spain, the German states, and beyond, pouring into Rome like a river of humanity. For the Church, a jubilee was meant to be a solemn proclamation of renewal. But under Alexander VI, it became something far more worldly. The papal coffers swelled as pilgrims purchased indulgences and offerings in quantities Rome had never seen before. Taverns brimmed with travellers, markets bustled, and the city's brothels did a brisk business alongside its basilicas. The Holy Year brought not only prayer, but scandal, not only incense, but coin. At the very heart of it all, the Borgia family presided over this golden moment. The papacy, corrupted and compromised though it was, stood at its zenith of power. Alexander VI was untouchable. He had survived assassination plots, tamed rival families through intimidation or alliance, and placed his children in positions of authority across Europe. His grip on the papal states was firmer than ever, his authority unquestioned within Rome's walls, and Cesare had become his father's instrument of conquest. With French support, he carved his way through the Romagna, subduing city after city with a blend of cunning diplomacy and naked brutality. Imola, Forli, Pesaro, Cesena, each fell under his control. He struck swiftly, punished treachery ruthlessly, and rewarded loyalty with calculated generosity. Mercenaries who betrayed him were executed without hesitation, their bodies left as grim warnings. Yet those who bent the knee found in Cesare a leader as pragmatic as he was ruthless. By 1501, Cesu's reputation was legendary. To some, he was the butcher of Italy, a man who ruled by fear and poisoned daggers. To others, he was a visionary, a prince in the making, who might finally bring order to a land fractured by feuds and petty lords. Even Niccolo Machiavelli, who observed him closely, confessed a grudging admiration. Cesare was in Machiavelli's eyes the living embodiment of political genius, the prince who understood that fortune favours the bold, that cruelty, if well used, could be a tool of stability. With the Borgias at the height of their strength, the Vatican became more than a seat of faith. It became the nerve centre of a family dynasty rivaling any monarchy in Europe. The Pope's robes were no longer symbols of universal humility, but banners of clan power. Alexander VI had achieved what many popes had dreamed of: secular dominion, but in doing so he had blurred the sacred beyond recognition. It was in this atmosphere, Rome swollen with pilgrims, papal coffers overflowing, Cesare triumphant in the field, that the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts was conceived. October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve. When medieval tradition held that the boundary between sacred and profane was at its thinnest, the symbolism could hardly have been more provocative. Why did it happen then? Perhaps it was triumphalism, a celebration of the Borgias' unshakable dominance at a moment when no rival dared challenge them. Perhaps it was meant as political theatre, a demonstration to Rome's elites that even the holiest walls in Christendom were subject to Borgia will. Or perhaps it was simply the natural culmination of years of unchecked excess, the moment when appetite no longer felt the need to disguise itself. Whatever the reason, the timing was perfect in its irony. On the very night when Christians remembered the dead and prayed for salvation, Alexander VI, Cesare, and their circle would gather in frescoed halls for a spectacle that would stain the papacy for centuries. The Jubilee had filled the city with faith and hope, but within the Vatican's inner chambers, those virtues were about to be trampled beneath candlelight and laughter. The stage was set, the players chosen. Rome itself held its breath. The Banquet of Chestnuts begins. Cesare Borgia's apartments inside the Vatican were among the most lavish spaces in Renaissance Rome. The walls were frescoed by Pinturicchio, glowing with scenes of both Christian saints and classical mythology. There were martyrs enduring their trials, Christ enthroned in majesty, but also nymphs, satyrs, and gods of Olympus cavorting across plaster. It was a visual contradiction that suited Cesare perfectly. The sacred and the pagan side by side, the holy and the profane, mingled as if they were one. Beneath those painted figures, the evening of October 31st, 1501, unfolded with a grim kind of inevitability. The guest list reflected the strange breadth of Borgia influence. Cardinals, men whose red robes proclaimed their role as princes of the church, filed into the chambers alongside Roman nobles in brocaded doublets. Ambassadors from European courts mingled discreetly, their presence a reminder that even scandal could be political theatre. And at the centre of it all, Cesare himself moved with the ease of a general inspecting his troops, his gaze sharp, his smile thin. But the true stars of the evening were the courtesans. 50 of them carefully chosen, dressed in silks that clung to their bodies, jewels catching the flicker of candlelight. They were not mere street women, but Rome's most accomplished companions, schooled in the art of pleasing powerful men while keeping their secrets. To those who saw them step into the Vatican halls, it was as if Venus herself had brought her retinue to the house of Peter. Dinner was served first, and it glittered with all the excess that the Borgia name had come to represent. Platters of roasted game sweetmeats, exotic fruits and delicacies imported from Spain and the Levant were carried in by servants. The wine flowed endlessly. Deep red poured from the papal cellars that had aged it in cool Roman caves. At the tables, conversation sparkled. Nobles boasted of estates and battles, cardinals exchanged wry jokes at the expense of rivals, and diplomats leaned close to measure the shifting winds of papal favour. Laughter echoed clinking goblets punctuating every jest. The atmosphere was one of triumph. Cesare had returned victorious from the Romagna, and Alexander VI himself presided from a place of honour. Guests toasted, voices swelling with the kind of confidence that comes when men believe themselves untouchable. Outside, Rome slumbered in reverence for All Hallows' Eve. Inside, the Vatican throbbed with wine power and anticipation. Watching it all, as if from the shadows, was Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies. His duty was not to participate, but to observe, to stand ready should protocol demand his hand. But as the evening unfolded, his pen became sharper than any sword. Later in his Liber Notarum, Burchard would record the events with the same dry, detached precision he applied to coronations or masses. He did not moralize, did not rage, did not soften. He noted who was present, what was eaten, how the courtesans danced, and what followed once the plates were cleared. It was this very detachment that would give his account its enduring weight. For Burchard was no gossiping courtier, no fiery reformer hurling accusations. He was an accountant of ritual and notary of detail. And when he wrote that the Pope's son gathered 50 courtesans in Vatican apartments for an entertainment unlike any other, historians could not dismiss it as rumour. His clinical words would become the scaffold upon which the legend of the Banquet of Chestnuts would be built. That night, beneath the painted saints and gods, the dinner ended. The plates were cleared and the true entertainment began. The scandalous entertainment. The transformation from feast to spectacle began almost imperceptibly. At first, the courtesans danced in silken gowns, their movements graceful, their laughter blending with the music of lutes and flutes. Servants cleared the platters of venison and fruit, pushing the tables aside to create a space in the centre of the frescoed chamber. The light of dozens of candelabras shimmered across gilded goblets and jewelled hairpieces, and the saints painted above seemed to watch with unblinking eyes. The music quickened, and with it the dancers shed their layers. A jewelled clasp undone here, a veil slipping there until fabric pooled like fallen petals on the marble floor. Gasps and laughter rose from the cardinals and nobles as the dancers moved in synchrony, the glow of candlelight tracing the lines of their bodies. What had begun as entertainment now pressed against the edges of sacrilege. In this space consecrated by papal authority, where liturgies had been sung and masses offered, the boundaries between holy and profane blurred until they nearly vanished. It was then that Cesare's infamous invention began. Servants gathered the candelabras from the tables and set them upon the floor, arranging them in a circle. Between these islands of flickering light they scattered chestnuts, humble fruits of autumn, now transformed into tokens of degradation. At Cesare's command, the courtesans dropped to hands and knees, crawling naked across the marble to collect the chestnuts one by one. Their movements caught in pools of candlelight, their shadows stretched monstrously against the walls as nobles and churchmen laughed and cheered. And presiding over it all sat Pope Alexander VI, his heavy frame sunk into a chair of honour, Cesare at his side, and Lucrezia, his daughter, also present. Chroniclers would debate for centuries what role she played that night. Was she a willing participant in her family's decadence, or a young woman trapped by her father's ambitions, compelled to endure the spectacle in silence? The sources conflict, but what they do not dispute is her presence. The image is inescapable. The Pope, his son and his daughter, watching 50 courtesans crawl for chestnuts in candlelight. The evening's climax turned the private into public sport. Cesare offered prizes, silken tunics, fine shoes, jewelled caps for the men who could prove themselves most virile, bedding the greatest number of courtesans before the assembled company. Servants were tasked with keeping count as if tallying scores at a tournament. What should have been acts of intimacy were transformed into contests played out beneath frescoes of saints and martyrs, while laughter and applause filled the air. Johann Burchard, ever the recorder, described it without flourishes words as clinical as an autopsy. The dancing, the disrobing, the crawling for chestnuts, the prizes offered for sexual performance. He did not rage, nor condemn, nor sensationalize. He simply noted. And in that spareness lies the horror. For the papal apartments on that All Hallows Eve had become a theatre of degradation where sacred dignity collapsed beneath human appetite. To later generations, this night would symbolize the nadir of papal corruption. But for those present, it was not history-only pleasure and spectacle. Only afterward, as whispers spread through Rome, would the enormity of what had transpired begin to take shape. Rome wakes to rumour. The morning after the Banquet of Chestnuts dawned like any other in Rome. The bells of St. Peter's rang for Mass, pilgrims shuffled into the basilica with prayers on their lips, and the Pope himself appeared in public with the gravity of a shepherd tending his flock. To the outside world, the Vatican moved in its usual rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place the night before. But Rome was never a city of secrets. Servants carried trays, musicians carried instruments, guards stood watch, and all of them carried stories. By dawn, the whispers had already begun. A page who had lingered too long near the papal apartments spoke of women crawling on marble floors. A servant told a tavern keeper of chestnuts scattered among candelabras. A musician, his hand still sore from playing until sunrise, let slip the tune that had accompanied the courtesan's dance. The stories spread like fire through dry grass. By evening, Rome's taverns buzzed with details, each version more lurid than the last. Cardinals were said to have boasted of their prowess. Nobles bragged of the silks they had won. The Pope himself was described as laughing, while his daughter looked on. Some accounts were exaggerations, others outright inventions, but at their heart lay a kernel of truth. Something obscene had indeed taken place in the Vatican's most private chambers. And beyond Rome, the scandal travelled even faster. Ambassadors who had been present or had informants close at hand sent letters to their courts. These dispatches, preserved in archives from Venice to Paris, reveal a mixture of fascination and disgust. The Pope and his son, wrote one, have turned the Holy Palace into a theatre of vice. Another, more measured but no less damning, warned that the papacy's moral authority was collapsing its example, a mockery of Christendom. For reformers across Europe, the banquet was manna from heaven. Preachers who had long denounced the corruption of Rome seized upon the reports as living proof of their accusations. In Florence, followers of the executed Savonarola pointed to the scandal as confirmation that the Vatican was indeed Babylon, reborn, a harlot draped in scarlet robes. In the German states, murmurs began that if the Pope himself indulged in such spectacles, then the Church's claim to holiness was nothing but a lie. Even within Catholic strongholds, unease spread. How could the man who styled himself the Vicar of Christ preside over such depravity? How could cardinals, shepherds of the faithful, sit in silence or in laughter, while courtesans crawled naked for chestnuts at their feet? The banquet became more than a night of indulgence. It became a symbol of everything broken in the Church, its greed, its hypocrisy, its indifference to the very morality it preached. And yet inside the Vatican, Alexander VI remained unshaken. The Pope, who had purchased his crown with gold, who had raised his children to positions of power with open scandal, was not about to let whispers divert him from his ambitions. Where others saw disgrace, he saw only the fleeting amusement of enemies. But beyond Rome's walls, those whispers were gathering into something greater, a storm of criticism that would one day swell into reformation. The chestnuts had been swept away, the candles extinguished, but the rumours once loosed would not be gathered up again. The papacy unravels. In the weeks and months that followed the Banquet of Chestnuts, the Vatican might have chosen the path of repentance. Alexander VI could have used the scandal as a turning point, curbing excesses, silencing gossip with reform, and restoring dignity to the papal throne. But that was never in Rodrigo Borgia's nature. Rather than step back, he doubled down. The Pope's public face remained one of solemn authority. He blessed pilgrims, presided over ceremonies, and gave audiences to ambassadors with the gravitas expected of the Vicar of Christ. Yet in private nothing changed. The banquets continued, the indulgences were sold with greater vigour than ever, and Cesare's campaigns consumed both the treasury and the Pope's attention. For Alexander, survival meant forward momentum. To stop was to invite weakness, and weakness was fatal in the game of Italian politics. Meanwhile, Cesare pressed ahead with his conquests in Romagna. With French support and papal backing, he continued to reduce the patchwork of the independent lords into a single dominion under his control. The Romagna bled, but it bent. Cities like Rimini, Faenza, and Urbino fell one after another. Some surrendered under siege, others were betrayed from within. Cesare's methods remained as ruthless as they were effective. Treachery was met with swift executions, loyalty rewarded with calculated generosity. To his supporters, he was a new kind of prince, fearless, pragmatic, almost invincible. To his enemies, he was the executioner of Italy, a man who ruled with the cold efficiency of the blade. Even in Florence, where the memory of Girolamo Savonarola still smouldered despite his execution in 1498, reformers seized upon the banquet as vindication. Savonarola had thundered from the pulpit that Rome was a new Babylon, that the Pope himself had become Antichrist in purple robes. His enemies had silenced him with fire, burning him in the Piazza della Signoria. But the reports of the chestnut orgy gave his words new life. What he had prophesied, many now believed had been proved true. Across Europe, the papacy's moral credibility withered. Even Catholic monarchs who relied on papal blessing to legitimize their rule wrote in private of their disgust. In Germany, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Priests and scholars began to ask how salvation could be sold for coin, how sins could be washed away by indulgences issued under a pope whose own household reeked of scandal. In England, in France, in Spain, reformers whispered that the head of the church had become indistinguishable from the most corrupt of secular princes. What the Banquet of Chestnuts crystallized was not merely outrage over a single night, but the recognition that the papacy itself was infected at its core. A pope who presided over chestnut games and sexual contests was not a shepherd but a showman, a man who had traded the cross for a crown of earthly pleasure. Alexander's defiance only deepened the wound. By refusing to acknowledge his corruption, he inadvertently confirmed it in the eyes of his critics. Every coin taken for indulgence, every cardinal appointed for a bribe, every city conquered by Cesare became another nail in the coffin of papal credibility. The murmurs were becoming voices, and the voices would soon become a roar. For now, the Borgias still held the reins of power. But Europe was watching, and Europe was losing faith. Death and collapse. The Borgia dream built on gold blood and scandal collapsed with terrifying swiftness. On the evening of August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI sat down to a meal with his son Cesare, as he had countless times before. By dawn, the Pope was writhing in agony, fever racking his body. Some whispered of poisoned wine meant for another guest, others of tainted fruit. Officially, it was recorded as malaria, the ever-present plague of Rome's swamps. But few in that city of daggers and conspiracies believed it was mere chance. The rumour of poisoning spread like wildfire, for it seemed a fitting end for a man whose reign had been steeped in treachery. For days the once mighty Alexander lay dying in his chambers, his skin darkening, his body grotesquely swollen. Chroniclers describe a scene almost symbolic in its horror, the most powerful man in Christendom reduced to a spectacle of corruption made flesh. At 62, the Pope, who had outmanoeuvred kings and crowned his children with power, was dead. His death was not marked by reverence but by relief. Rome exhaled, and the eternal city which had endured his reign like a fever turned eagerly to the prospect of new leadership. Without his father's protection, Caesar's empire crumbled overnight. Though still formidable, he no longer had papal coffers to fund his armies, or papal decrees to legitimize his conquests. Rivals he had terrorized for years struck back with vengeance. The Orsini and Colonna families, old enemies of the Borgias, closed in. Even his French allies, once so critical to his rise, hesitated now that Alexander was gone. Cesare tried desperately to cling to power. He fortified his holdings, maneuvered politically, even attempted to secure the next conclave by influencing the cardinals. But without the Pope behind him, he was no longer the Wolf of Italy. He was just another mercenary commander. Within 4 years he was captured, shipped to Spain, and stripped of what little remained of his dignity. In 1507, at the age of 31, Cesare died in a skirmish in Navarre, fighting as a soldier for hire. The man Machiavelli had hailed as the perfect prince ended, not as a king, but as a corpse on a foreign battlefield, his ambitions buried in alien soil. Lucrezia Borgia, meanwhile, carved out a different fate. Married into the Este family of Ferrara after the scandalous years in Rome, she reinvented herself as a cultured duchess. Patron of poets and painters, she presided over one of the most sophisticated courts in Italy. Her reputation, so darkened by rumours of incest and poison in her youth, softened with time. In Ferrara she was admired for her grace, her intelligence, and even her piety. Yet the shadows of her family never fully left her. The name Borgia remained a whisper of infamy, no matter how brightly she tried to shine. The papacy itself, eager to purge the memory of Alexander, turned quickly to erasure. His successor, Pope Julius II, refused to live in the Borgia apartments, declaring them tainted by sin. Instead, he commissioned Raphael to paint new frescoes in rooms above, creating the celebrated Stanza di Raffaello. The decision was more than architectural, it was symbolic. The Renaissance genius would replace Pinturicchio's compromised images with visions of divine wisdom and philosophy, a deliberate attempt to overwrite the moral decay of the Borgias with the glory of new ideals. Thus the rooms that had once echoed with laughter music and the crawling of courtesans in the Banquet of Chestnuts became silent, their doors closed, their infamy lingering only in whispers. Visitors would later marvel at Raphael's brilliance, unaware that beneath their feet lay frescoes that had once watched the most scandalous night in papal history. The dynasty that Alexander had sought to forge through his children was shattered. Cesare dead, Juan murdered Lucrezia, rehabilitated but tainted, and Geoffrey forgotten. The papacy, though, weakened, endured. But the memory of Alexander VI, his corruption, his ambition, his banquets clung to the church like a stain that even centuries of prayers could not entirely wash away. Memory and debate. The Banquet of Chestnuts might have been forgotten, dismissed as a rumour whispered in taverns, had it not been for Johann Burchard's relentless quill. His matter-of-fact diary ensured that the event endured. But history is not written in ink alone, it is also written in interpretation. And across the centuries, the scandal of Alexander VI's papacy became a battlefield of competing narratives. For Catholic historians, especially during the 16th to 19th centuries, the banquet was a wound too deep to leave exposed. Many sought to deny it outright, insisting that Burchard's account must have been interpolated, altered by enemies of the church, or exaggerated by Protestant polemicists. They argued that such indecency could not possibly have occurred in the papal apartments, and if it had, it must have been exaggerated beyond recognition. The Vatican itself sealed away the Liber Notarum for centuries, granting access only to trusted scholars, as if hoping that silence might erase the stain. Even when the archives were cautiously opened in the late 19th century, Pope Leo XIII expressed deep reluctance to let researchers peer too closely into those pages. The fear was clear: to admit the record was to admit the fallibility of the papacy itself. On the other side, Protestant historians embraced the scandal eagerly. For them, the banquet became Exhibit A in their case against Rome. Here, they claimed, was living proof that the papacy was not a holy office, but Babylon incarnate, a den of sin masquerading as the Church of Christ. Pamphlets and sermons gleefully retold the chestnut game the courtesans the prizes for lust painting Alexander VI as the Antichrist himself. In Protestant imagination, the Borgia Pope embodied everything corrupt about Catholicism, worldly, lecherous, greedy, and utterly divorced from the teachings of Christ. Between denial and exploitation, the truth seemed in danger of being lost. But modern historians reading Burchard with critical eyes have reached a middle ground. While some details may have been amplified in retellings, the core of his record is considered largely accurate. What makes it believable is precisely Burchard's tone-flat, unemotional, almost bureaucratic. He described the chestnuts on the floor with the same care used to list the number of candles at a mass. That very dryness makes invention unlikely. To understand the scandal properly, modern scholars place it in the cultural context of the Renaissance. Sexual displays, masquerades with courtesans, and public revels were not unknown in the courts of secular rulers. In Ferrara, Naples, and even Florence, feasts often included lewd performances that blurred the line between entertainment and depravity. To nobles steeped in the values of the Italian Renaissance, such spectacles, though extravagant, were not unimaginable. What made the Banquet of Chestnuts shocking was not the acts themselves, but where they occurred and who presided. If a duke in Urbino or a prince in Milan had hosted such a spectacle, it would have raised eyebrows, but little more. That it took place in the papal apartments with the Pope himself present transformed it from a bawdy revel into a blasphemy. The Vicar of Christ was not meant to mimic secular princes in their vices. His authority was spiritual, his duty sacred. That he should sit in judgment over a contest of lust, watching courtesans crawl for chestnuts by candlelight, shattered the image of papal dignity. Thus, the scandal's endurance lies not only in its salacious detail, but in its symbolic weight. It was the moment when the papacy seemed to abdicate its spiritual mission, trading the cross for the cup of Bacchus. To Catholics, it became an embarrassment to be buried, to Protestants a weapon to be wielded, and to modern readers a mirror reflecting the tensions of an age when the sacred and profane lived side by side never more uneasily than in the Vatican of Alexander VI. The story of Alexander VI and the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts is not just a tale of Renaissance scandal, it is a parable of human weakness, ambition, and the dangers of power without restraint. If we look past the silk gowns, the candlelit orgies, and the frescoed walls, we find lessons that remain startlingly relevant today. The first lesson is that power reveals more than it creates. Rodrigo Borgia did not become corrupt only after donning the papal tiara. His corruption was already seeded long before in the nepotism of his uncle Calixtus III, in his relentless pursuit of wealth, and in his open indulgence in mistresses and children while a cardinal. The papacy did not transform him, it exposed him. So it is with all leaders, authority unmasks character. Titles and positions magnify what lies hidden within. The second lesson is the fragility of moral authority. The papacy was meant to symbolize unity and holiness, yet Alexander VI treated it as a dynasty, elevating his children, selling indulgences, and presiding over excess. When he blurred the sacred with the profane, he undermined the very foundation of the institution he led. In our own lives, this warns us that credibility, whether in a family, community, or organization, is built slowly but can be lost in an instant. A single act of betrayal, a single abuse of trust may cast shadows that last for generations. A third lesson emerges from Cesare Borgia's rise and fall ambition without limits becomes self-destruction. Cesare was brilliant, ruthless, and admired even by Machiavelli, yet his successes depended on his father's papacy, and when Alexander died, Cesare's empire collapsed almost overnight. His story reminds us that ambition must be anchored in something deeper than fleeting power. If your achievements rest only on the shoulders of another, or on structures built without integrity, they vanish as quickly as they rise. Then there is Lucrezia's story, often clouded by rumour. Used as a pawn in her family's political games, she shows us the cost of being treated as an instrument rather than a person. Her later rehabilitation in Ferrara suggests resilience, but also how easily individuals can be exploited when those around them value power above humanity. It is a lesson about dignity. Never allow yourself or others to become merely pieces on someone else's board. Finally, the scandal itself, the courtesans crawling for chestnuts under painted saints, embodies the eternal struggle between the sacred and the profane. Human beings live at the intersection of aspiration and temptation. We are capable of soaring achievements, but also of degrading lapses. The lesson here is not to deny our weaknesses, but to recognize them, to guard against environments that nurture corruption, and to strive always to align power with responsibility. The Banquet of Chestnuts may seem far removed from our world of boardrooms, parliaments or neighbourhoods, but its lessons remain: power unmasks us. Authority demands integrity. Ambition must be tempered by wisdom. And the sacred, whether it is faith, trust, or the principle, must never be sold cheaply for fleeting pleasure. In the end, history whispers what life confirms, what we build on corruption crumbles, what we root in truth endures. If this story sent chills down your spine but kept you hooked until the very end, then know this: there are countless more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered. Forgotten scandals, dark ambitions and truths that shape the world, stories your history books never dared to tell. Hit. Like if you want more people to discover these long-buried secrets. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Timelines and ring the notification bell, because every week we open the doors to the past and step into the stories that still echo in our present. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the greatest life lesson from Pope Alexander VI's infamous Banquet of Chestnuts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because history isn't just something we learn, it's a mirror we hold up to ourselves.